Every human alive today comes from the same small beginning. And yet, when we look at each other, nothing seems the same. Different skin, different faces, different bodies, so different that we were taught to believe these differences must mean separation. But they don't. If all humans share one origin, then why did nature allow such visible distance to grow between us? Why did the same species slowly divide into forms that no longer recognize themselves as related? At some point, the environment began writing on the body. Sunlight, cold, hunger, altitude, scarcity. Not enough to notice, but enough to continue. No one decided this. No one guided it. It happened while humans were busy surviving, and somewhere along the way, we mistook adaptation for identity. We confused surface with meaning. We assumed difference must imply division. This story is not about race. It is not about culture. It is about time, and what time quietly does to bodies that are trying to stay alive. You are listening to the history of human difference, a history that begins with sameness. What follows is not a list of traits, not a catalogue of differences, but a single process, unfolding in many places at once. The first thing that must be understood is that human difference did not begin with appearance. It began with movement. Early humans did not remain near their point of origin. They moved outward in slow waves, not with intention, not with awareness of consequence, but because survival required it. Food shifted, climate shifted, water sources changed. Each movement placed the same biological body into slightly different conditions. And those conditions did not act once. This is the foundational cause that never changes. When a human population remained in one environment long enough, the environment applied pressure. Not dramatic pressure, not sudden transformation, but steady, repetitive influence. Sunlight touched skin every day. Cold pulled heat from the body every night. Thin air demanded more oxygen with every breath. Scarcity reshaped metabolism meal by meal. None of these forces asked the body to become something new. They asked it to cope a little better. Coping is not redesign. Coping is adjustment. The human body already possessed systems capable of adjusting. Skin already regulated exposure. Blood already transported oxygen. Limbs already balanced heat retention and release. What changed was not the existence of these systems, but how strongly they were expressed. Small shifts occurred because small shifts were enough. Over a single lifetime, these changes were barely noticeable. Over hundreds of generations, they accumulated. This accumulation explains why difference feels large now while having begun invisibly. It is essential to recognize that these changes occurred at the surface first. Surface traits are where the body meets the environment directly. Altering them carried lower risk than altering deeper systems. Changing skin pigmentation did not threaten reproduction. Changing facial structure slightly did not disrupt organ function. Adjusting body proportions did not interfere with cognition. These were safe places for variation to appear. The core remained protected. Because the core remained protected, populations did not become biologically incompatible. Humans could still recognize one another as the same kind of being beneath visible contrast. This recognition was not cultural, it was biological. It was enforced by compatibility. Wherever humans met again, after long separations, they could still integrate, reproduce, and continue as one species. This is why difference expanded without fragmentation. Another factor reinforcing this process was time. Time did not act evenly. Some populations remained in similar environments for thousands of years. Others moved repeatedly. The longer a population stayed, the more pronounced local adaptations became. The shorter the stay, the more transitional the traits remained. This created gradients rather than boundaries. There was never a line where one type of human ended and another began. There were only gradual shifts across geography. Gradients are the signature of one origin spreading outward. If humans had separate origins, differences would cluster into distinct biological groups. They do not. Instead, traits blend into one another across regions. Genetic evidence confirms this blending. Most human genetic variation exists within populations, not between them. Two people living near each other can be more genetically different than two people living far apart. This fact directly contradicts the intuition that appearance reflects deep separation. The intuition persists because the human brain is tuned to notice contrast, not continuity. Contrast is useful for immediate decisions. Continuity requires memory across time. Evolutionary processes operate on timescales the brain does not intuitively grasp. As a result, the present moment exaggerates difference and hides accumulation. But accumulation is the key. Each generation inherited a body slightly tuned to its environment, not a new body altogether. Nothing reset. Nothing restarted. The same genetic thread continued forward, expressing itself differently depending on conditions. When conditions changed, expression changed again. No adaptation was permanent unless the pressure remained permanent. This is why appearance is unreliable as a marker of origin. It reflects recent history more than ancient beginnings. The deeper origin remains embedded in what did not need to change. Human developmental stages remained the same. The structure of the skeleton remained the same. The organization of the nervous system remained the same. Emotional responses, social instincts, and cognitive capacities remained within the same narrow range across all populations. These similarities persist because changing them would have offered no advantage. They already worked everywhere, so the environment wrote on the body selectively. It altered what could change cheaply and left intact what was costly to alter. This selective writing is what we now read as human diversity. It is not a message about division. It is a record of exposure. Seen this way, difference no longer implies distance from origin. It implies duration of contact with specific conditions. Darker skin implies long exposure to intense sunlight. Lighter skin implies long residence, where sunlight was scarce. Compact bodies imply cold retention. Slender bodies imply heat release. None of these require separate beginnings. They require time. Time, applied unevenly, produces variation. And because humans never stopped moving entirely, because contact was reduced but rarely eliminated, these variations never hardened into something irreversible. Connection prevented deep divergence. Movement ensured continued mixing. Even minimal contact was enough to preserve unity. This balance between separation and connection is why humans remain one species despite appearing so different. Too much isolation would have fractured the lineage. Too much uniformity would have limited expansion. Humans occupied the narrow space between those extremes. That space allowed difference to appear without forcing division. Everything that follows in this story returns to this same cause. One origin, moving across varied environments, adjusting at the surface, accumulating small changes over long periods, while remaining connected enough to stay whole. And staying whole was never accidental. It was the consequence of how human populations spread without ever fully sealing themselves off from one another. Even when distance increased, isolation was incomplete. Groups separated, adapted locally, and then encountered others again. Each encounter blended traits back into the wider population, preventing any single adaptation from becoming absolute. This repeated pattern separate slightly, adapt slightly. Because of this, human diversity did not grow in isolated blocks. It grew as a network. Traits emerged in response to local pressures, then softened or redistributed when movement resumed. Over long periods, this created a global mosaic rather than a set of disconnected pieces. A mosaic can look fragmented at close range, but it is made from a single underlying structure. This explains why attempts to classify humans into rigid biological categories always fail. The categories feel intuitive because they are based on visible traits, but those traits do not align with the deeper structure of human variation. Boundaries drawn on the surface do not correspond to boundaries in biology. They are convenient simplifications, not reflections of origin. The reason visible traits mislead is that they are shaped by a narrow set of pressures. Skin tone responds primarily to sunlight. Body proportions respond primarily to temperature. Facial features respond to airflow, humidity, and diet. These pressures act independently of one another. A population can share one trait with a distant group and a different trait with a neighboring one. This recombination further blurs any attempt to divide humans cleanly. The shared origin becomes clearer when looking at traits that are not under strong environmental pressure. Bone structure follows the same developmental plan everywhere. Teeth emerge in the same sequence. Muscles attach in the same places. Organs perform the same functions with the same limitations. These similarities are not superficial. They define what it means to be human biologically. They persist because changing them would have offered no survival advantage. In many cases, altering core systems would have been dangerous. Evolution favors changes that improve survival at low cost. Surface traits fit this requirement. Core traits do not. This cost-benefit logic governs the entire process. Wherever a small change could help without risking failure, it accumulated. Wherever a change threatened stability, it was resisted, over thousands of generations. This logic produced bodies that looked different, while functioning in fundamentally the same way. Time magnifies this effect. A small shift repeated often becomes obvious. A large shift that happens rarely disappears. The body remembers what repeats. Environments repeat unevenly. Some conditions persist for millennia. Others change quickly. The longer a condition persists, the more strongly it shapes appearance. This is why geographic stability matters. Regions with stable climates produce more pronounced local traits. Regions with fluctuating conditions produce more blended ones. But in both cases, the underlying process is the same. No new origin is required, only exposure and duration. The mind often expects evolution to move toward clarity, toward distinct forms that can be labeled and separated. Human evolution moved toward coverage. It prioritized reaching many environments over specializing deeply in any one. This strategy favored adaptability over divergence. Adaptability, however, leaves messy outcomes. It produces overlap instead of clean edges. It produces gradients instead of categories. These outcomes frustrate classification but explain survival. The question of why humans look so different persists because classification feels satisfying. It offers closure. Process does not offer closure. It offers continuity. Continuity feels incomplete to a mind trained to look for endpoints. But continuity is exactly what preserved the human lineage. There was never a moment when humans paused and became something else. There were only moments when humans stayed just long enough for the environment to leave a mark, and then moved again. Those marks accumulated into patterns that are now visible at a global scale. Seen without time, these patterns look intentional. Seen with time, they look inevitable. The inevitability comes from simple rules applied repeatedly. Exposure shapes expression. Expression accumulates with duration. Connection prevents fragmentation. None of these rules require foresight or direction. They operate automatically wherever humans exist. Because they operate everywhere, they produce diversity everywhere. This also explains why modern humans continue to change. New environments introduce new pressures. Artificial lighting alters exposure cycles. Diet changes metabolic demands. Reduced physical labor alters body composition. Global movement redistributes traits faster than before. These forces are already leaving subtle marks. If humans remain connected, these marks will remain compatible. If isolation increases, divergence could deepen. The process has not ended, only the context has shifted. So when asking why humans look different if they share one origin, the answer is not something that happened once in the distant past. It is something that has been happening continuously. Difference is not a finished outcome. It is an ongoing response. And because it is ongoing, it never needs a new beginning to explain it. It only needs time. Time turns movement into history. History turns adjustment into appearance. Appearance turns continuity into visible difference. But continuity itself never left. Everything that follows every example, every trait, every comparison returns to this same structure. One origin moved outward, encountered uneven conditions, adapted at the surface, accumulated small changes, remained connected, and stayed whole. Human difference did not persist because humans avoided separation by chance. It persisted because the conditions required for true biological separation never fully formed. For a species to divide, isolation must be complete and sustained. In human history, that condition was never met. Distance existed, but it was temporary. Barriers existed, but they were permeable. Movement slowed, but it did not stop. This mattered because adaptation alone is not enough to create new origins. Adaptation must be paired with permanent isolation. Humans experienced adaptation without isolation. As a result, visible traits changed locally, while the underlying biological structure remained shared. This is the central mechanism. Traits adjusted where they interacted directly with the environment. Skin, body shape, and facial features shifted because they were exposed. But these shifts never reached the deeper systems that define compatibility. Reproduction, development, and internal organization remained aligned across all populations. Because compatibility remained intact, no adaptation ever became exclusive. Local traits could emerge, but they could always reintegrate. When populations encountered one another again, variation blended rather than collided. Difference accumulated, but it never crossed the threshold that would require a new origin to explain it. This is why appearance cannot be treated as essence. Appearance records recent environmental pressure, not biological identity. It shows where adaptation occurred, not where origin changed. Confusing the two creates the illusion of division where none exists. Once this distinction is made, the question simplifies. Humans look different because adaptation operated continuously at the surface, while the core remained conserved. The same biological system expressed itself differently under different conditions, without ever becoming a different system. Nothing more is required to explain what we see. The story does not need escalation or resolution because the process is still active. As long as humans inhabit varied environments while remaining connected, appearance will continue to shift, and origin will continue to remain shared beneath those shifts, unchanged, uninterrupted, and sufficient to account for every visible difference. The next layer of the explanation becomes clearer when attention stays fixed on where change was allowed and where it was not. Human evolution did not distribute change evenly across the body. It concentrated change in traits that could vary without disrupting survival, while protecting traits whose alteration would have carried high risk. This uneven distribution is not incidental. It is the mechanism that produced diversity without division. Consider what had to remain stable for humans to remain one species. Development from embryo to adult had to follow the same sequence. Organs had to coordinate in the same way. The nervous system had to process information within the same limits. Reproduction had to remain compatible across populations. Any deep divergence here would have ended shared origin. None occurred, so change was redirected outward. Surface traits absorbed pressure because they could. Skin pigmentation could shift without altering organ function. Body proportions could vary without disrupting movement. Facial structure could adjust without impairing cognition. These traits sit at the interface between body and environment, and interface is where adaptation is cheapest. Cheap changes accumulate. Expensive ones are resisted. This explains why visible difference expanded rapidly compared to deeper biological difference. It also explains why that difference feels decisive even when it is not. The eye is drawn to interfaces. Biology is governed by cause. As populations moved, the same pattern repeated. A group settled. Conditions applied pressure. Surface traits adjusted. Time allowed those adjustments to accumulate. Then movement resumed, or contact occurred, blending variation back into the wider population. Because it ran continuously, no local adaptation ever had the chance to harden into a defining boundary. This is why the question must always return to duration. Short exposure produces little change. Long exposure produces visible change. But duration alone is not enough to produce separation. Duration must be paired with complete isolation. Humans rarely experience both together. When one increased, the other weakened. That imbalance preserved unity. The idea that humans divided into forms that no longer recognized one another biologically is a retrospective illusion created by looking at endpoints without paths. Endpoints exaggerate contrast. Paths reveal continuity. When paths are restored through genetics, archaeology, and geography, the illusion dissolves. Everywhere paths are traced, they intersect. These intersections matter because they prevented speciation. Even infrequent intersections were enough. Biology does not require constant mixing to remain unified. It requires only that isolation never becomes absolute. Humans met that condition again and again. The result is a species that looks diverse but behaves as one. This behavior is measurable. Humans share the same ranges of fertility, the same vulnerability to disease categories, the same developmental milestones, the same emotional and cognitive capacities. These are not superficial similarities. They are decisive. They persist because they were never under selection to change. Selection did not reward deeper divergence. It rewarded local efficiency. Local efficiency does not require a new origin. It requires small, repeatable adjustments layered onto an existing framework. That framework remained intact because it worked everywhere humans went. This is why human diversity increases smoothly rather than in jumps. Jumps would signal new beginnings. Smooth gradients signal spread from a single source. Human variation forms gradients across latitude, altitude, and climate. There are no natural breaks that demand separate origins. Wherever one looks closely, intermediate forms appear. This continuity undermines any attempt to explain difference through fragmentation. Fragmentation would leave gaps. Human history leaves overlaps. Another way to see this is to observe how quickly some traits respond to environment even today. Changes in diet affect body composition within generations. Sun exposure alters skin response within a lifetime. Altitude triggers physiological adjustments almost immediately. These responses echo long-term adaptations, showing that the body is designed to adjust expression without rewriting structure. Short-term flexibility mirrors long-term evolution. The long-term changes we now see are simply these flexible responses repeated across many generations under stable conditions. Nothing new had to be invented. Nothing old had to be discarded. The same capacities were used again and again. This repetition explains why the explanation never needs to escalate. Adding more examples does not add more causes. It reinforces the same one. One origin expressing itself differently because it encountered different conditions for different lengths of time. The persistence of the question comes from a mismatch between how evolution works and how perception interprets outcomes. Perception wants categories. Evolution produces continua. Perception wants fixed forms. Evolution produces provisional ones. When provisional forms are mistaken for final states, difference feels unresolved. But provisional is the correct state. Human appearance has never been final. It has always been conditional. It reflects where ancestors lived recently relative to deep time. It does not reflect where the species began. The beginning sits deeper in what never needed to change. Once this hierarchy is clear, core conserved, surface flexible, the story stops expanding outward and starts closing inward. Every visible difference maps back to the same process. Every apparent separation collapses into continuity when traced carefully. So the explanation does not move toward a climax. It stabilizes. Humans look different because the same biological system negotiated different environments for long enough that surface traits diverged. Humans share one origin because that negotiation never required the system itself to split. That balanced surface variation, core conservation, is not accidental. It is the reason the species survived expansion without fragmentation. And as long as humans remain mobile and connected, the same balance will continue to operate, producing new differences without ever producing new origins, exactly as it has from the beginning. And because that balance has never broken, the explanation does not need to change as the story continues. Human diversity can only be understood by holding two constraints together at all times. Variation was permitted where it was low risk, and variation was blocked where it would have threatened continuity. This dual constraint shaped everything that followed. It explains why bodies adjusted without fragmenting and why difference accumulated without ever requiring a second beginning. The body did not respond to environment by reinventing itself. It responded by tuning what was already there. Tuning preserves structure. Reinvention replaces it. Humans were tuned, not rebuilt. This distinction matters because tuning produces gradients, while reinvention produces boundaries. Human variation is gradient-based everywhere it is examined closely. Traits shift gradually with geography, climate, and duration of residence. No sharp biological edges appear. Sharp edges would signal isolation long enough to force divergence. Their absence signals ongoing connection. This is why human appearance does not cluster into discrete biological sets, despite superficial contrast. What looks like clustering dissolves when intermediate populations are considered. The clusters are artifacts of limited perspective, not reflections of origin. Perspective collapses distance and exaggerates endpoints. Time restores continuity. When time is reintroduced, every apparent split resolves into a sequence of small changes layered onto the same framework. That framework endured because it remained functional across all environments humans encountered. Selection did not favor replacing it. Selection favored preserving it, while allowing outward adjustment. This preservation explains why deep biological systems align globally. The same developmental timing, the same organ coordination, the same neurological constraints, and the same reproductive compatibility appear everywhere. These are not minor similarities. They are decisive indicators of a single lineage. Appearance, by contrast, reflects how that lineage interacted with its surroundings recently enough for the marks to remain visible. It is not a signature of origin, but a log of exposure. Confusing a log with a source produces the illusion of division. The source remains unchanged beneath the record. This becomes even clearer when considering how human populations respond to new environments today. Changes in lifestyle, climate control, and diet are already altering surface traits again. These changes are occurring without any suggestion that a new kind of human is forming. The same body is responding as it always has. The mechanism has not shifted. Only the inputs have. This continuity of mechanism across radically different contexts confirms that difference is not evidence of multiple origins, but of a single origin capable of repeated adjustment. The mind resists this conclusion because it prefers finality. It wants difference to resolve into categories that feel complete. But biology does not resolve that way. It remains provisional as long as conditions remain variable. Human appearance will continue to shift because the environments humans inhabit continue to differ. That does not threaten unity. It depends on unity. Without a shared framework, variation would collapse into incompatibility. With it, variation remains expressive without becoming divisive. This is the central logic that must remain in view. Humans look different because difference was the safest place for change to occur. Humans share one origin because the places where change would have broken compatibility were protected. Everything else follows from that arrangement. No additional causes are required. No hidden separations need to be invoked. The explanation remains sufficient because it is rooted in constraint, not speculation. Constraint determines what can change and what must remain. In humans, the constraints favored outward diversity and inward conservation. That is why visible difference expanded while origin stayed singular. And because the constraints have not disappeared, the same pattern continues. Future humans will look different from present ones in new ways, just as present humans look different from past ones. But the lineage will remain one, not because difference is limited, but because it is channeled. Channeling allows variation without fracture. Fracture would require the removal of constraints that have never been removed. As long as those constraints hold, human diversity will continue to grow on the surface, while remaining anchored to the same beginning beneath it, quietly, continuously, and without ever crossing the boundary that would turn variation into separation. For a lineage to split, isolation must be complete and prolonged, and selection must reward incompatibility rather than integration. Human history consistently failed to meet those requirements. Movement persisted, contact recurred, and selection favored solutions that worked locally without breaking global compatibility. This is why change accumulated as modulation rather than replacement. The same biological system kept encountering different constraints and solved them by adjusting parameters, not by redesigning architecture. Parameter changes are reversible and blendable. Architectural changes are not. This distinction explains why difference can grow large without ever becoming decisive. It also explains why the same explanation applies across all traits. Skin pigmentation tracks ultraviolet exposure because pigment regulates exposure efficiently. Body proportions track temperature because surface area mediates heat exchange efficiently. Facial form tracks airflow and diet because structure mediates intake efficiently. Each adjustment sits exactly where efficiency gains are highest and risk is lowest. None of them alter the underlying developmental plan. That plan, how tissues differentiate, how organs coordinate, how systems mature, remained conserved because it already met every environment's demands well enough. Conservation here is not inertia, it is optimization. Once a system works across contexts, changing it offers little advantage and high risk. Selection therefore preserves it and spends its budget elsewhere. This budgeting logic governs evolution everywhere. But it is especially visible in humans because the species expanded rapidly into diverse environments without losing contact. Rapid spread increases exposure variance, while intermittent contact limits divergence. The result is breadth without fracture. Breadth produces gradients. Gradients frustrate classification because they refuse clean edges. But gradients are exactly what one origin spreading outward should produce. Where time was long and conditions stable, gradients steepened into pronounced local expressions. Where time was short or conditions variable, gradients flattened into transitional forms. Neither case implies a new beginning. Both imply duration interacting with exposure. This is why genetic distance remains shallow across humanity. The genome records lineage and mixing, not surface outcomes. Mixing, even when rare, erases deep splits over time. Humans mixed enough. They mixed irregularly, unpredictably, but sufficiently. That sufficiency is what matters. It kept the genetic thread continuous, even as appearances diverged. Appearance, meanwhile, remained free to track recent history. Recent history is louder to perception than ancient continuity. The mind hears the loudest signal first and mistakes it for the most important one. But importance in biology is measured by constraint, not volume. The most constrained elements change least and matter most. In humans, those elements are shared everywhere. This is why compatibility persists universally. It is why developmental milestones align. It is why cognitive ranges overlap. It is why physiological limits coincide. These are not trivial similarities, they are the definition of a single species. Visible difference sits above them, not instead of them. Humans look different because the safest places to change were allowed to change repeatedly under uneven conditions. Humans share one origin because the places where change would have broken the system were protected by constraint and reinforced by contact. Nothing else is needed to explain the outcome. The process is sufficient, and its sufficiency is demonstrated by its consistency. Add new examples, and the same logic applies. Extend time forward, and the same logic predicts future change without division. The explanation does not conclude because the process does not conclude. As long as humans remain mobile and connected, exposure will differ, duration will vary, and expression will shift accordingly. The surface will keep recording history, and the core will keep carrying origin. Difference will continue to appear without ever demanding separation, because separation would require abandoning the constraints that have always preserved continuity. Those constraints remain in place. They are the reason one beginning could travel so far, adapt so widely, and still remain one lineage, expressing many forms without ever becoming many origins. The same outcome keeps repeating without deviation. The human lineage continues to generate variation without approaching a breaking point, because the forces that shape variation are still operating within limits that favor continuity. This can be seen most clearly by examining how selection prioritizes efficiency over distinction. Selection does not reward difference for its own sake. It rewards solutions that reduce cost under specific conditions. When two populations face different conditions, the most efficient solutions may differ, But efficiency does not require incompatibility. It requires only that a solution fits locally. As long as local solutions do not interfere with shared systems, they can coexist within a single lineage. Humans repeatedly occupied environments where local efficiency could be improved without touching shared systems, and so variation accumulated in predictable places. This predictability is crucial. If variation were random, the explanation would weaken. But it is not random. It concentrates in traits that mediate interaction with climate, light, diet, and terrain. These mediating traits act like adjustable interfaces. They can be tuned up or down without altering the machine behind them. Machines that can be tuned rather than rebuilt are resilient. Resilience allowed humans to spread faster than specialization would have permitted. Specialization locks a population into narrow conditions. Humans avoided deep specialization by keeping their core flexible and their interfaces adjustable. This strategy favored range over refinement, coverage over precision. It also ensured that when populations met again after periods of distance, reintegration was straightforward. No deep rewiring was required. Compatibility was already there. Reintegration erased extremes and redistributed variation, preventing local solutions from becoming permanent divisions. Over time, this cycle repeated often enough to keep divergence shallow. Shallow divergence is exactly what genetic evidence reveals. It shows clustering without isolation, similarity without sameness, difference without distance. These patterns are not ambiguous. They are consistent across datasets and methods. The only ambiguity arises when appearance is treated as primary evidence. Appearance is immediate and compelling, but it is not foundational. It reflects the most recent pressures most strongly. Recent pressures are uneven. Ancient origins are not. When recent pressures dominate perception, difference feels decisive. When ancient continuity is restored to view, difference becomes contextual. Context changes interpretation. It shifts the question from "what are humans?" to "what conditions shaped them here?" That shift dissolves the need for multiple origins. It replaces it with a single moving origin, expressed under many conditions. This moving origin did not carry a fixed template for appearance. It carried a set of constraints and capacities. Constraints limited how far change could go. Capacities allowed change to occur where it helped. Together, they formed a channel. Variation flowed through that channel without spilling into separation. Channels do not eliminate flow. They guide it. Human evolution guided variation rather than suppressing it. Suppression would have limited expansion. Unbounded variation would have fractured the lineage. Guidance achieved both adaptability and unity. This guided variation explains why differences appear meaningful, yet never decisive. They matter for local survival, but not for defining the species. They are functional, not essential. Essential features remained stable because they defined compatibility. Compatibility defined the lineage more strongly than any visible trait ever could. This is why human diversity cannot be mapped cleanly onto ancestry. Ancestry follows lineage and mixing. Appearance follows environment and duration. These two histories intersect but do not coincide. Where they diverge, intuition falters. The mind expects coincidence. Biology does not require it. Understanding this non-coincidence is the final adjustment needed to keep the explanation from drifting. Once it is accepted, every apparent anomaly resolves. Similar-looking populations may be distant genetically. Dissimilar-looking populations may be close. Neither case challenges the shared origin. Both are expected outcomes of the same process, operating unevenly. The process itself remains simple. Humans moved. Conditions varied. Adjustments accumulated where cheap. Core systems remained protected. Contact persisted enough to preserve unity. Time amplified surface differences without deepening separation. No additional mechanism is needed. No exceptional event must be invoked. The explanation holds because it is constrained by what evolution can and cannot do efficiently. Evolution rarely invents new architectures when tuning existing ones suffices. Humans were tuned extensively. They were not rebuilt. Tuning leaves traces that look dramatic when viewed statically. Rebuilding would have produced discontinuities. Discontinuities are absent. Their absence is evidence. It shows that despite vast visual diversity, the lineage never crossed into multiple origins. It stayed within the same channel, expressing variation as needed while maintaining the same underlying structure. As this continues into the future, the pattern will not reverse. New environments will impose new pressures. Interfaces will adjust again. Some traits will become more common. Others will fade. But the same constraints will still apply. Changes that threaten compatibility will be blocked. Changes that improve local efficiency will accumulate. The surface will continue to record history. The core will continue to carry origin. And the question will continue to arise, not because the explanation is weak, but because perception keeps encountering difference without immediately seeing the channel that guides it. When the channel is seen, difference stops implying separation. It implies movement within limits. Movement within limits is the signature of a single lineage, adapting across space and time, remaining one while appearing many, and doing so not by chance, but because the structure of the process makes any other outcome unlikely. And unlikely outcomes are precisely what evolution avoids. Evolution favors paths that can be repeated reliably, not paths that depend on rare alignments. Human diversity followed a repeatable path because it relied on ordinary pressures acting on ordinary bodies over long spans of time. Nothing exceptional was required. No special divergence had to occur. The same pressures that shape all organisms shaped humans as well. But humans carried an unusual combination of mobility and connectivity that kept those pressures from isolating populations completely. Mobility ensured exposure to many environments. Connectivity ensured that exposure did not harden into separation. This combination explains why variation spread widely, while lineage remained narrow. The lineage did not need to split to solve local problems. It solved them by adjusting expression. Expression is flexible by design. It is meant to vary. It is also meant to revert when conditions change. Reversibility matters because it prevents adaptations from becoming commitments. Humans accumulated many reversible changes rather than a few irreversible ones. This choice, enforced by selection, preserved unity while permitting breadth. Breadth allowed humans to occupy environments that would have defeated a more specialized species. A species locked into narrow forms must either retreat or divide when conditions change. Humans did neither. They expanded and adjusted instead. Adjustment left traces. Traces accumulated unevenly because environments are uneven. Uneven accumulation produces contrast. Contrast invites interpretation. Interpretation often overshoots cause. It treats contrast as destiny rather than as record. But records can be read correctly or incorrectly. Reading human appearance as destiny misreads a record of exposure as a statement of essence. Reading it as record restores coherence. The record shows where and how long bodies interacted with specific pressures. It does not show new beginnings. New beginnings would require new constraints, new compatibilities, new developmental plans. None appear. Development follows the same order everywhere. Growth follows the same phases. Aging follows the same arc. These shared trajectories anchor the lineage. They are not incidental similarities. They are the scaffolding that held everything else together. Because the scaffolding remained, the surface could change freely. Free change at the surface is why difference appears large. Constrained change at the core is why difference remains shallow. Shallow difference can look deep when magnified by time and geography, but magnification does not change depth. It changes visibility. Visibility is what the mind responds to first. The mind then searches backward for a cause that matches the scale of what it sees. When it fails to find a dramatic cause, it invents one. Multiple origins feel dramatic enough to match visible diversity. But drama is not evidence. Process is evidence. The process here is simple and sufficient. Humans carried one framework into many contexts. Contexts varied, framework did not. Variation accumulated where allowed. Conservation persisted where required. Contact interrupted isolation, often enough to prevent deep divergence. Time amplified surface differences without altering underlying compatibility. Each component reinforces the others. Remove any one, and the outcome would differ. Remove mobility and variation would be limited. Remove connectivity and variation would fracture the lineage. Remove duration and variation would be invisible. Humans experienced all three. That experience produced exactly what we see. Nothing more and nothing less. The persistence of the question reflects a mismatch between the timescale of perception and the timescale of evolution. Perception compresses. Evolution stretches. Compression hides continuity. Stretching reveals it. When continuity is revealed, the question stops escalating. It stabilizes. It no longer asks for additional mechanisms. It asks only to be followed carefully. Following it carefully shows that every apparent divergence resolves into modulation of the same system. Modulation does not create new systems. It creates variance. Variants remain linked by shared constraints. Constraints are the quiet governors of evolution. They decide what is possible long before selection decides what is likely. In humans, constraints favored unity. They limited how far change could go without cost. They rewarded solutions that worked across contexts. They penalized solutions that sacrificed compatibility for local gain. Over time, these penalties prevented the emergence of incompatible forms. Incompatible forms would have been evolutionary dead ends, given the degree of movement and mixing humans experienced. Compatible forms thrived. Thriving forms spread. Spread increased exposure. Exposure increased variation. Variation remained channeled. The loop reinforced itself. This self-reinforcing loop explains why diversity kept growing while the lineage stayed singular. It also explains why future diversity will follow the same pattern. As long as humans remain capable of movement and maintain some level of connection, the loop will persist. New pressures will arise. New adjustments will appear. Some will be visible. Many will not. All will occur within the same constraints that have always governed the lineage. The result will look new but feel familiar. Difference will increase without demanding separation. Appearance will continue to shift without redefining origin. Origin will remain what it has always been, the shared framework that makes every adjustment intelligible and every variation compatible. When this framework is kept in view, the story stops needing additions. It does not grow by piling on explanations. It holds by repeating the same logic across scales. Repeated small changes explain large differences. Continuity explains why large differences do not imply large separations. This logic applies everywhere humans are found. It does not depend on region, culture, or era. It depends only on how bodies respond to conditions over time under constraints that favor compatibility. That dependence makes the explanation robust. It does not weaken when challenged by new data. New data fit it. Humans look different because they could afford to change where change was cheap. Humans share one origin because they could not afford to change where change would have been costly. Everything else is detail layered onto that foundation. And because the foundation remains, the details can continue to change without ever forcing the story to begin again. To begin again was never necessary because the process already solved the problem it faced. The problem was not how to become different, but how to remain viable across a widening range of conditions without losing the ability to function as one lineage. Human evolution answered that problem by channeling change into places where it improved fit without threatening integration. Integration mattered because movement never ceased. As long as humans continued to encounter one another, even intermittently, any change that undermined compatibility would be selected against. Compatibility was not an abstract preference. It was enforced by survival. Populations that drifted too far would lose the benefits of exchange, genetic, social, technological, and would be outcompeted by those that remained integrable. This pressure quietly constrained divergence while allowing expression to vary. Expression varied because it needed to. Local environments demanded local solutions. Cold favored heat retention, heat favored dissipation, low light favored efficient synthesis, thin air favored oxygen handling. Each demand nudged expression slightly. Each nudge was small. The power of the process lay in repetition. Repetition does not feel dramatic, but it is decisive. Over thousands of generations, repeated nudges produce outcomes that appear substantial when viewed all at once. The appearance of substance tempts the mind to infer a substantial cause, but the cause remained modest and consistent. No threshold was crossed where a population became something else. Thresholds matter because they signal irreversibility. Human changes were largely reversible. When conditions shifted, expression shifted back or redirected. Reversibility kept the lineage flexible. Flexibility kept it unified. Unity amplified reach. Reach increased exposure. Exposure increased variation. Variation remained channeled. The loop continued. This looping structure explains why diversity expanded without crystallizing into distinct biological kinds. It also explains why attempts to draw hard lines always fail under scrutiny. Hard lines require hard breaks. Hard breaks require sustained isolation and incompatible change. Humans did not experience that combination. They experienced partial isolation, temporary separation, and recurrent contact. Those conditions blur lines rather than sharpening them. Blurred lines are not confusion, they are evidence of continuity. Continuity is further supported by the way traits are sought independently. Facial form does not predict physiology. Independent assortment is exactly what one origin, expressing under different pressures, would produce. A single origin, fractured into multiple origins, would show coordinated packages of traits. Humans do not. They show recombination. Recombination is the fingerprint of connection. It reveals mixing over time, not separation. Genetics records this clearly. It shows shallow differences layered on a shared background. That background is not theoretical. It is measurable. It appears in the overwhelming similarity of genomes across the species. The small fraction that varies is sufficient to alter appearance, but insufficient to redefine identity. Identity in biology is defined by compatibility and shared developmental constraints. Those constraints remained. They remain today. Modern humans continue to demonstrate the same pattern. When people relocate, surface traits respond within lifetimes and across generations, while core systems remain stable. Diet alters body composition. Light alters circadian rhythms. Altitude alters oxygen utilization. None of these changes threaten compatibility. They mirror long-term evolution in compressed time. This mirroring is instructive because it shows the mechanism at work without requiring deep history. The mechanism is not mysterious. It is ordinary responsiveness guided by constraint. Ordinary mechanisms, repeated long enough, produce extraordinary outcomes. The extraordinary outcome here is global diversity without speciation. That outcome can feel counterintuitive because many species diversify by splitting. Humans diversified by spreading. Spreading favors integration strategies. Splitting favors specialization strategies. Humans favored the former because their mobility, sociality, and technology reduced the payoff of deep specialization. Technology buffered environments. Social learning transmitted solutions. These buffers reduce the need for biological reinvention. When culture solves a problem, biology can remain conservative. Conservatism at the core preserved unity. Conservatism does not mean stagnation. It means selective change. Selective change is efficient. It uses limited evolutionary budget where it yields the most benefit. The benefit was greatest at interfaces. Interfaces changed. Cores did not. This division of labor between interface and core is the organizing principle behind human difference. It explains why appearance can vary widely while physiology converges. It explains why differences feel meaningful yet fail to predict deep biological realities. It explains why the same explanation fits every region and every era. It also explains why the question persists. The mind keeps returning to endpoints because endpoints are easy to compare. The process lives between endpoints. Without the process, endpoints mislead. With the process, endpoints become markers along a path. Paths do not require multiple starts. They require continuity of movement. Human history is a path extended across the planet. Along that path, the scenery changed. The traveler did not. The traveler adjusted clothing, posture, pace, and habits to fit the terrain, but remained the same traveler. Appearance is the clothing of history. It reflects weather and terrain. It does not define who is walking. When this analogy is held carefully, it prevents drift. It keeps the explanation anchored to the central cause. Humans look different because the same body met different conditions for different lengths of time. Humans share one origin because that body never needed to become a different body to keep going. The mechanism is sufficient. It does not need reinforcement by exception or emphasis by repetition. It holds because it is constrained by what evolution can afford. Evolution afforded variation at the surface and conserved the core. That bargain worked. It worked so well that it continues to work. As long as it continues, difference will continue to appear without ever forcing a new beginning to explain it. To explain that continuation clearly, the focus must remain fixed on limits rather than outcomes. Limits determine what evolution can do efficiently. In humans, the most important limits were set by the need to remain compatible while moving across environments that changed faster than biology could specialize for. This created a strong bias towards solutions that worked broadly rather than narrowly. Broad solutions tolerate variation. Narrow solutions enforce separation. Humans repeatedly favored the former. As a result, the lineage accumulated many small adjustments instead of a few decisive breaks. These adjustments clustered in traits that mediated contact with the environment because those traits could vary without disrupting integration. Integration mattered because humans were never static. Even when groups stayed in one region for long periods, movement elsewhere continued, and eventual contact was likely. Any change that blocked reintegration would have reduced long-term success. Selection quietly filtered those changes out. What remained were differences that could coexist. Coexistence is the operational definition of shared origin. It does not require sameness. It requires that systems align closely enough to function together. Human systems did. They still do. This is why diversity expanded safely. Safety here means evolutionary safety, not comfort. It means that variation did not jeopardize reproduction, development, or survival across contexts. Whenever a potential change threatened those, it was not retained. Over time, this produced a stable pattern. Variability at the margins, conservation at the center. The center is not visible at first glance, which is why it is often ignored, but it governs everything else. The center includes how bodies are built, how they grow, how they repair, and how they interact biologically. These processes are tightly constrained because loosening them would increase failure rates. Failure rates matter more to evolution than novelty. Novelty without reliability disappears. Humans did not disappear. They proliferated. Proliferation favors reliability. Reliability favors constraint. Constraint favors shared origin. The visible diversity we see is the byproduct of a constrained system operating across varied inputs. Different inputs produce different outputs within the same limits. This is how machines behave when they are well designed. The design does not change. The settings do. Humans carried the same design everywhere. Settings shifted with context. The longer a setting persisted, the more it shaped output. But settings could always be reset. Resetting prevented lock-in. Lock-in would have required abandonment of compatibility. That abandonment never paid off. So it did not occur. This logic also clarifies why the human story resists simple categorization. Categories imply permanence. Human variation is conditional. Conditions change. Conditional traits change with them. Permanence belongs only to what is constrained. Constrained elements are the true markers of lineage. They tell us what could not change without breaking the system. Those elements align globally. They show that the system remained intact. When viewed through this lens, the apparent scale of difference becomes easier to place. Difference looks large because it is seen without reference to constraint. Add constraint back in, and difference shrinks to its proper scale. It becomes variation within bounds, not divergence beyond them. Bounds are rarely visible, but they are always present. They are enforced by development, physiology, and compatibility. They operate continuously, without announcement. Because they operate quietly, the mind tends to overlook them. It notices what varies, not what holds. But what holds is what matters for origin. Origin is defined by continuity of constraint, not by uniformity of expression. Expression is free to change as long as constraint is respected. Humans respected constraint by default because violating it reduced success. Over thousands of generations, this produced a lineage that could look many ways while remaining one. That outcome is not paradoxical. It is efficient. Efficiency explains why it happened and why it persists. As environments continue to vary, efficiency will continue to favor the same strategy. Surface traits will keep adjusting. Some will become more common, others will fade. None will require a new beginning to explain them. The same origin will continue to express itself differently under different conditions, guided by the same constraints that have always governed it. This is why the explanation does not accumulate complexity as it unfolds. It returns to the same principles repeatedly, because those principles are sufficient. Movement created exposure. Exposure created pressure. Pressure shaped expression. Duration amplified effects. Connection preserved compatibility. Constraint conserved the core. Each principle reinforces the others. Remove one and the picture distorts. Keep them together and the picture stabilizes. Stability here does not mean stillness. It means coherence across change. Humans achieved coherence without uniformity. That achievement is what we see when we look across the world and recognize difference without needing to invent separation to account for it. The lineage did not split because splitting was not the most efficient way to survive expansion. Adjustment was. Adjustment leaves traces. Traces invite questions. The answer to those questions remains the same because the process remains the same. Humans look different because the same constrained system encountered different conditions for long enough to record them on the surface. Humans share one origin because that system never lost its constraints. Those constraints still operate. They still guide change, and as long as they do, difference will continue to appear without ever requiring a new origin to explain it. That requirement never arises because the structure of the process prevents it. The continuity of the human lineage is not maintained by resisting change, but by directing it. Directed change is slower, safer, and easier to integrate than uncontrolled divergence. This is why human evolution favored modulation over transformation. Modulation adjusts degree. Transformation alters kind. Humans experienced the former repeatedly and avoided the latter almost entirely. This avoidance was not conscious. It was enforced by outcomes. Populations that drifted too far lost the ability to integrate and were outcompeted by those that remained flexible. Flexibility here does not mean constant change. It means the capacity to change where necessary and to stop where costly. That capacity depended on constraints that remained stable across time. Constraints are the hidden scaffolding of evolution. They determine which paths are available long before selection chooses among them. In humans, the scaffolding favored shared development, shared physiology, and shared reproduction. These shared elements created a narrow corridor within which variation could occur. The corridor was wide enough to permit noticeable diversity, but narrow enough to prevent speciation. Walking that corridor required balance. Humans maintained that balance because movement and contact never fully ceased. Even rare contact was sufficient to keep the corridor intact. Rare contact matters because it resets extremes. When populations reconnect, differences blend. Blending does not erase variation, it redistributes it. Redistribution keeps divergence shallow. Shallow divergence preserves compatibility. Compatibility preserves lineage. This cycle ran continuously. It did not need to be perfect. It needed only to occur often enough. It did. As a result, human diversity expanded horizontally rather than vertically. Horizontal expansion spreads traits across contexts. Vertical expansion creates distinct layers that no longer interact. Humans expanded horizontally. This pattern is visible in how traits are sought. They do not stack neatly. A person may share one trait with a distant population and another trait with a nearby one. This cross-cutting is incompatible with deep splits. It is exactly what mixing produces. Mixing is not random. It follows routes of movement, trade, and contact. Over time, these routes crisscrossed the planet. Each crossing reduced the chance of isolation becoming permanent. Permanence is the enemy of unity. Humans rarely achieved it. When they did, it did not last. Environmental change, migration, or expansion reopened contact. The reopening mattered more than the initial separation. It pulled the lineage back toward coherence. Coherence does not eliminate difference. It organizes it. Organized difference is stable. Unorganized difference fractures. Humans produced organized difference. Organization here comes from constraint and contact. Constraint limits what can change. Contact limits how far changes can go. Together, they shape outcomes that look diverse but remain compatible. This compatibility is not abstract. It can be observed in how easily humans integrate biologically wherever they meet. These shared responses indicate deep alignment. Deep alignment indicates shared origin. Surface variation does not contradict this. It sits on top of it. Sitting on top does not mean trivial. It means secondary. Secondary traits can vary widely, without altering primary structure. The mind often reverses this order because it encounters secondary traits first. It sees difference before it sees alignment. This reversal fuels the question. The question persists until the order is corrected. Correct the order, and difference takes its proper place. It becomes informative without being divisive. Informative difference tells a story about where and how humans lived. Divisive difference implies separate beginnings. The evidence supports the former and undermines the latter. This is why the explanation remains stable under scrutiny. Each new line of evidence reinforces the same constraints. Archaeology shows gradual spread. Genetics shows shallow divergence. Physiology shows deep similarity. Development shows shared pathways. Behavior shows overlapping capacities. No domain demands a new origin to explain what it observes. All domains converge on the same conclusion. Convergence matters because independent lines of evidence rarely align by coincidence. They align because they reflect the same underlying process. That process is constrained adaptation under conditions of movement and contact. As long as those conditions persist, the outcome persists. Modern conditions have changed the pace but not the logic. Faster travel increases contact. Technology buffers some pressures and introduces others. The buffering reduces the need for biological change in some areas. New pressures may increase it in others. Either way, changes will continue to target interfaces rather than cause. The pattern will repeat because it is efficient. Efficiency governs evolution more reliably than intention. Efficient strategies persist. Inefficient ones disappear. Human diversity as we see it is the product of an efficient strategy for expansion without fragmentation. It solved the problem it faced. It continues to solve it. That is why the story does not resolve into a final state. It remains dynamic. Dynamic does not mean unstable. It means responsive within limits. Those limits define the lineage. They have not shifted enough to permit a new origin. They may never need to. As long as humans remain capable of movement and maintain some level of connection, the same corridor will guide variation. Within that corridor, appearance will continue to change, sometimes noticeably, sometimes subtly. Outside it, change will be blocked. The boundary remains invisible but effective. It has always been there. It is the reason one beginning could generate so much visible diversity without ever becoming many beginnings. And it is the reason that every time the question is asked again, the answer remains sufficient, grounded not in speculation or exception, but in the ordinary, constrained workings of evolution over time. The explanation does not drift as the script approaches its end. What remains to be addressed is not a new mechanism, but the reason the same mechanism keeps being misunderstood. The misunderstanding comes from scale. Human perception operates at the scale of faces and lifetimes. Evolution operates at the scale of populations and millennia. When these scales are confused, difference feels too large to belong to one origin. When scales are aligned, difference shrinks back into proportion. At the correct scale, it becomes clear that human diversity never required a branching event. It demands isolation long enough to break compatibility and selection strong enough to reward incompatibility. Humans experienced neither consistently. What they experienced instead was repeated exposure to different pressures while remaining loosely connected. Loose connection was enough. It kept the lineage from drifting beyond recovery while still allowing local expression to develop. Local expression is what dominates appearance today. It is what the eye sees first. But local expression is always contingent. It depends on where a population stayed, how long it stayed, and what pressures remained stable during that time. Change any of those variables, and expression changes. That mutability alone disqualifies appearance as a marker of origin. Origin cannot be contingent. It must persist across contingency. In humans, it does. This persistence is visible in the limits of variation. No human population has developed a fundamentally different body plan. No population has crossed into a new reproductive mode. No population has diverged in a way that prevents integration. These absences are as informative as any presence. They show where evolution stopped. It stopped at the point where further change would have risked coherence. Risk matters. Evolution does not push change to its theoretical limits. It pushes change until the marginal benefit no longer outweighs the marginal cost. For humans, the marginal cost of deep divergence was always high because of mobility and contact. The marginal benefit of surface adjustment was often sufficient. So change accumulated where benefit was high and cost was low. This cost-benefit balance operated everywhere humans went. That is why the explanation applies universally. It does not depend on specific regions or eras. It depends on constraints that traveled with the species. Those constraints shaped outcomes regardless of local detail. When outcomes are shaped by constraints rather than by chance, patterns repeat. Repetition produces reliability. Reliability produces confidence in explanation. The more human diversity is examined, the more consistently it aligns with constrained adaptation rather than with fragmentation. This consistency is not abstract. It appears in how traits respond today. When people move between environments, bodies adjust in predictable ways. When exposure changes, expression shifts. When exposure stabilizes, expression stabilizes. When contact resumes, variation blends. These dynamics are visible within lifetimes. They mirror long-term evolution because the same mechanisms are at work. The mirroring matters because it removes the need for speculation. One does not need to imagine ancient events differently from present processes. The present shows how the past worked, just more slowly. Slow repetition produced what fast observation now captures all at once. This collapse of timescale is what makes difference feel decisive. The mind sees many endpoints simultaneously and infers many beginnings. But endpoints are not beginnings. They are snapshots taken at different points along the same path. Without the path, snapshots mislead. With the path restored, snapshots align. Alignment resolves tension. It does not erase difference. It contextualizes it. Context shows that human diversity is neither accidental nor problematic. It is the expected outcome of one lineage expanding widely under constraints that favor compatibility. Remove any part of that description, and the outcome would differ. Keep it intact, and the outcome follows inevitably. This inevitability is why the explanation does not require reinforcement. It stands because alternatives fail under the same constraints. Multiple origins would predict deeper incompatibilities. Deep incompatibilities are absent. Rapid speciation would predict clustered trait packages. Packages are absent. Long-term isolation would predict sharp boundaries. Boundaries are absent. What remains matches constrained spread. As the script moves toward its final stretch, nothing new needs to be added. The remaining work is to let the explanation settle into its simplest form. Humans look different because difference was the safest way to adapt. Humans share one origin because anything more would have been too costly. That trade-off governed the entire history. It is still governing it. Future differences will arise for the same reason past differences did. Environments will continue to vary. Bodies will continue to adjust at interfaces. Core systems will continue to be conserved. Contact will continue to prevent deep divergence. The lineage will remain one, expressing itself many ways without ever needing to split. The story therefore does not conclude with resolution, it concludes with stability. Stability here means explanatory stability, not biological stillness. Change will continue. The explanation will not need to. As that stability settles in, the explanation can be allowed to slow without losing clarity. At the end of the story, what matters most is not adding another layer, but holding the core steady long enough for it to feel inevitable. Human diversity does not require constant reinforcement because it does not rest on exception. It rests on ordinary processes applied patiently. Ordinary movement, ordinary exposure, ordinary adjustment, repeated across long stretches of time, within limits that never loosened enough to permit fragmentation. Those limits are the quiet reason the lineage stayed singular. They constrained what could change and protected what could not. They allowed bodies to answer local demands without rewriting the system that made those answers possible. When conditions differed, expression differed. When conditions overlapped, expression blended. When contact resumed, extremes softened. Nothing about this required coordination or intent. It followed automatically from how selection weighs cost against benefit under conditions of mobility and partial connection. Because the benefits of deep divergence were low and the costs were high, divergence remained shallow. Because the benefits of surface adjustment were high and the costs were low, variation accumulated there instead. This simple accounting explains the entire outcome. It explains why difference is obvious and unity is subtle. It explains why appearance invites comparison, while origin requires inference. It explains why the question persists even when the answer is consistent. At the correct scale, the answer stops competing with alternatives because alternatives fail the same test. They predict patterns that are not observed. They require breaks that never appear. The observed patterns, gradients, overlaps, recombination, shallow genetic distance, universal compatibility, fit constrained adaptation exactly. They do not fit fragmentation. So the final understanding does not arrive as a revelation. It arrives as alignment. The many pieces of evidence line up behind the same mechanism. When they do, the question loses its tension. Difference no longer points outward toward imagined separations. It points inward toward a shared capacity to adapt without breaking. That capacity is what was inherited most reliably. It was passed on not as a trait you can see, but as a way the body responds. It allowed one origin to travel far, encounter many conditions, and remain whole. It allowed history to be written on the surface, while continuity stayed beneath it. As the story ends, nothing closes. The process continues. New environments will apply new pressures. Bodies will answer where they can. Interfaces will adjust. Core systems will hold. The same constraints will guide change, just as they always have. Difference will keep appearing because the world keeps varying. Unity will keep persisting because the lineage never needed to split to survive that variation. This is why the explanation does not need a conclusion. It needs rest. It needs to be left in the place where it fits naturally. One beginning, extended rather than divided. One system, adjusted rather than replaced. One species, diversified, without ever crossing the line that would require a new origin to explain it. As that stability settles in, the explanation does not need to push forward. It only needs to remain still long enough to feel natural. What holds the story together is not a final insight, but the quiet consistency of the process itself. Human diversity does not depend on rare events or special exceptions. It emerges from ordinary forces applied patiently, over and over again, across time that stretches far beyond individual lives. Movement happened because it had to. Exposure followed because environments differed. Adjustment occurred because the body could respond without risk. Nothing more was required. Limits played a silent role throughout this process. They did not announce themselves, but they shaped every outcome. Bodies answered local demands without disturbing the deeper systems that made those answers possible. When conditions differed, expression shifted. When conditions overlapped, expression blended. When contact returned, extremes softened. No planning was involved. No direction was chosen. It unfolded automatically from how survival balances cost and benefit under conditions of mobility and partial connection. Because deep divergence offered little advantage and high risk, it never advanced far. Because surface adjustment offered clear benefit at low cost, it accumulated there instead. This uneven distribution of change explains everything that followed. It explains why difference is immediately visible while unity is not. It explains why comparison comes easily, while understanding takes time. It explains why the question keeps returning, even when the underlying process never changes. When the scale is corrected, the tension dissolves. Alternatives fall away on their own, not because they are argued against, but because they fail to match what is observed. The patterns that actually appear: gradual shifts, overlap, blending, shallow distance, easy compatibility, align smoothly with constrained adaptation. They do not align with separation. So understanding does not arrive as a moment of discovery. It arrives as quiet agreement. Many lines of evidence settle into the same place. When they do, difference stops pointing outward toward imagined divides. It points inward toward a shared way of responding to the world without breaking under it. That shared way was not inherited as a visible trait. It was carried forward as a tendency, a flexibility, a capacity to adjust while remaining coherent. It allowed history to leave marks on the surface without disturbing what lay underneath. It allowed change to continue without forcing a reset. Nothing ends here. The process remains active. Environments will keep shifting. Pressures will keep appearing. Bodies will keep responding where they can and resting where they must. Interfaces will continue to adjust. Deeper systems will continue to hold. Variation will continue to show itself because conditions are never identical for long. The explanation does not close because it does not need to. It settles. It rests in the only place it fits comfortably. A single unfolding process, carried forward through time, changing gently where change is safe, remaining steady where it matters, allowing difference to appear without ever turning it into distance. The final stretch arrives. The explanation no longer needs to move forward. It only needs to slow enough for its shape to become familiar. Everything essential has already appeared, not as a conclusion to be reached, but as a pattern that has been quietly present the entire time. Human difference does not stand apart from that pattern. It rests inside it. What remains is the rhythm of the process itself. Bodies continued to encounter environments that asked different things of them. Responses formed where they could form safely. Over time, those responses accumulated into visible variation. None of this required a moment of change, a decision, or a turning point. It happened the way breathing happens, continuously, without announcement. As conditions repeated, certain traits became common. As conditions shifted, those traits softened or redirected. Nothing needed to be erased, nothing needed to be replaced. The body carried forward what still worked, and adjusted only where adjustment did not threaten stability. This is why difference feels present, but never final. It is always provisional, always responding to what is happening now more than to what happened long ago. Beneath that motion, something steadier remained. Not a shape that could be pointed to, and not a feature that could be named, but a shared way of functioning that stayed aligned across every place humans lived. That alignment did not demand attention because it did not change. It simply continued, quietly supporting every surface adjustment without interfering. When the mind stops expecting a finish, this steadiness becomes easier to sense. The question relaxes because it no longer needs to be answered in a decisive way. Difference stops asking to be explained and starts being observed. It becomes a record rather than a problem, a trace rather than a divide. The world never offered identical conditions for long. Light shifted, temperature shifted, food shifted. Bodies answered each shift as best they could, carrying those answers forward only as long as they remained useful. This back and forth between condition and response never broke its rhythm. It only layered new variations on top of old ones, allowing some to remain visible and others to fade. As long as this rhythm continues, appearance will continue to change. Some differences will become more noticeable, others will blur. None of them will settle into something permanent because permanence was never the goal. And viability favored flexibility over fixation, adjustment over division. The story does not end because the process does not end. It moves at the pace of generations, slow enough that no single moment stands out, steady enough that nothing needs to reset. What we see now is only the current arrangement of responses, shaped by recent history, resting on a foundation that did not need to announce itself in order to remain intact. So the final understanding does not arrive with emphasis. It arrives with quiet familiarity. Humans look different because they have been living under different conditions for long enough that bodies responded. They remain connected because those responses never touched what needed to stay aligned. Change was allowed where it was safe, and restrained where it was not. With that balance in place, nothing else needs to be added. The explanation does not close itself. It simply settles into stillness, leaving difference where it belongs on the surface, while continuity remains underneath, carrying everything forward gently, patiently, and without interruption, as it always has.